And he told them, your nation has been weighed in the balances and found wanting. The kingdom is now given to the Medes and Persians. And that night, Belshazzar, the king, was slain. The Persians came in. They took over the whole Babylonian empire. They came in on the dry riverbed, under the city gates, into the city, and took the place without a fight. The defenders were all drunk. And the name of the man was given 120 years before he was even born. Here he was, and there's no doubt that this existed. This prophecy has been in the Jewish hands for thousands of years, and it's older than Nebuchadnezzar's time. It was written long before. Thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus. Cyrus was the king of the Persians that took Babylon, whose right hand I have holden, to subdue nations before him. I will loose the loins of kings, to open before him the two-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut. That was written 120 years before Cyrus was born, even giving his name. We know that history shows us that Medo-Persia overtook Babylon. Now the third kingdom of brass was going to be a rule after the kingdom of silver. And in turn, Medo-Persia was conquered by Grecia under Alexander the Great. Who's heard of Alexander the Great? Well, who hasn't heard of him? Do you know, friends, that at the age of 25 years of age, Alexander the Great had already conquered so much that he had the largest empire of history by the age of 25. Can you imagine that? Boy, he did well, didn't he? He just raced over the earth. And the time came when there was this big battle between Alexander and the Persians. I'll tell you something interesting. The book of Daniel actually said that the first king of Grecia was going to be the one who would be responsible for overcoming the Persians. It named the Persians. It said the Persian Empire. This is in the 8th chapter, written by Daniel, the same young man, that the Persian Empire was going to be defeated by the Grecian Empire. Now this was hundreds of years before the event actually occurred, and that the first king of the Grecians to reign over the Grecians would be the one that was also going to conquer the Persian Empire. That's really pinning it down to a single man, isn't it? Now, Alexander the Great was sweeping through from Europe into the Middle East, and he got a little bit upset with the Jews in Jerusalem because he had asked them to help him with something before he arrived. In other words, he was trying to tell them, hey, turn over to my side before I get here and help me. Otherwise you'll be in trouble because I'm going to take you anyway. And because they didn't do that, he came down to punish Jerusalem. Well, friends, a very strange thing happened. The priests of Judah came out of the city. They marched along the highway toward Alexander the Great's army, and representatives from Alexander the Great saw them coming, so they went forward, and then representatives of the Jewish side came forward, and they had a meeting. And at that meeting, friends, Alexander ended up being shown a book. And it was the very same book of Daniel that we're talking about tonight, which had been written 200 years earlier. And he showed Alexander the Great, the man who showed him the book, showed Alexander the Great this prophecy in the book of Daniel that said that the first king of Grecia was going to win against the Persians and take the Persian Empire. As soon as Alexander realized that he was mentioned in the book, he said to the Jewish people, well, look, I'm not going to worry you now. You just be good people, be part of my empire, and there'll be no trouble. And there was no fighting. A prophecy saved Jerusalem on that occasion. Absolutely astonishing. There's no other book, friends, that has prophecies like that in it. Alexander the Great's conquests actually are well known. Very swift, very successful, and at the age of 33, Alexander the Great had nowhere else to go without stretching his army beyond endurance. I mean, he conquered and occupied all that he could physically do with the size armies that he had. And there in the year 331, he took over the territory of the Persian Empire. And Alexander the Great lived for another 8 years, and then he drunk himself to death, died of alcoholic poisoning, because he got so bored. Poor man. Now, friends, we have the next section of the image, or the statue, which says there will be a fourth kingdom. By the way, before we get to that fourth kingdom, it mentions that brass was the metal. Brass is inferior to silver. So here we've got a kingdom of Babylon, which was the most splendorous kingdom the world had seen, followed by an inferior kingdom which still was able to overtake it, followed by one still inferior, just as the metals are becoming inferior, yet it was able to overtake the Persian Empire. And somebody actually told Alexander the Great that he believed he must have been chosen by God to do the job. Well, certainly Alexander was not a saint, but he fulfilled a prophecy, and that's interesting enough. And then came a fourth kingdom, which, and by the way, the brass, it's interesting that the historian Herodotus, you may have heard of Herodotus, speaking of Greek pirates coming ashore, said that these armies of brass came ashore out of the sea. Greece was known for its brass armour, and the armies of Greece were brazen. So here we go. We come to a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, and iron can break things and smash things. And this was to be typical of the kingdom that was going to overtake the Grecian Empire. In the year 168 BC, at a very fierce and surpassing battle, the Roman forces defeated the Greeks, and Roman power began. And Rome began to continue her conquests. That was on June the 22nd, 168. There's the historian writing on his book, The History of Rome, 144 years after Alexander died. The Romans, of course, were fierce fighters, and the iron fist of Rome soon put down all dissension until the Roman world became at peace. And there was no fighting for many, many years. Rome built great highways. She had a system that kept the empire united. Roman power was strong. It was like iron. In fact, the historian Gibbon calls Rome the Iron Monarchy of Rome. It's interesting how historians many years later recognized that the prophecy was coming true. And the Roman Empire was the one that took the place of the Grecian Empire and took over that territory plus more. It's also interesting, friends, that the Babylonian Empire had a head represented by Nebuchadnezzar. Then the next part had two arms, which represented the twofold section of the Medo-Persian Empire. You see, two countries came together to fight Babylon, Media and Persia, and it became the Medo-Persian Empire. Then came Alexander, which took the place of that empire. Then came Rome, which eventually was divided into two legs, the Eastern Empire and the Western Empire. So it's appropriate that the human body was used in the prophecy so aptly to the events of history that followed. And the Roman Empire was even though it was not the most magnificent of empires, it was the strongest empire that had been in the past. And Rome actually would not tolerate rebellion. We know that the images of gold or silver or brass might serve to represent the nations and their kings. They were successively broken by the iron monarchy of Rome. Now, here's a history book. This is a secular historian writing, and he actually quotes the prophecy when he says this is how history happened. Prophecy that was written long, long before. Very interesting. And the Roman Empire, friends, stretched across that territory in particular and became more of a European power. It's interesting that the seat of government was steadily becoming further west. And Rome, of course, the city of Rome became the seat of this amazingly powerful empire, the Iron Monarchy of Rome. And the Arch of Titus in Rome commemorated victory over their enemies. Here is a Roman coin of the Caesars. The Caesars actually and their characters are also mentioned in the book of Daniel, that this man would be followed by this man who would be like this, and this man would be followed by this man who would be like this, and it comes right down to our day and says what's going to happen. Now, it's interesting that Rome did split into two divisions, just like you have the two legs, and Constantine went east from Rome to found Constantinople, which is today called Istanbul. And now we come down to the feet of the image. And Daniel's still talking to the king of Babylon about all this. He says, just as you saw that the feet and toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom. So Rome was going to become a divided kingdom. The people will not remain united any more than iron will mix with clay. Now, I think you all know that you get a piece of clay and you get some iron, you try to mix them together, it just won't happen. There's no way. They'll still remain separate. You can force them, but they'll still remain separate and break apart, ultimately. And so we have the nations of the earth coming against the Empire of Rome later on. They were called the barbarians. There was the Huns and there were the others. They were all coming from different directions. And Rome got into a state where there was a lot of money in the cities. People had lots of time on their hands, lots of entertainment. They just became obsessed with sport, and they became very, very violent. Corruption was rife right through the land. Politics was corrupt. Medicine was corrupt. The education system was corrupt. Corruption just went right through Rome. They had so much leisure that they didn't know what to do with themselves, and they became very weak. And when the barbarians came, they began to bite into the Empire of Rome just like a hammer. Hammer, 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 and Rome began to break up. Now, the prophecy said that it would break up, and it was not going to be conquered by a fifth world empire. See, Babylon was going to be conquered by another kingdom. That kingdom was going to be conquered by a third kingdom. That was going to be conquered by a fourth kingdom, but the fourth kingdom was going not to be conquered. It was going to break up. Now, this is going into detail, isn't it? If Daniel had said that Babylon was going to break up, he would have been wrong. Or that the third empire was going to break up, he'd be wrong. The fact is, he said the third empire would be conquered by the fourth and it would break up. Now, battle after battle with the barbarians couldn't save Rome. And interestingly, Rome broke up into exactly 10 nations. Here they are: the Alemanni, the Burgundians, the Franks, the Lombards, the Huari, Vandals and Ostrogoths, the Saxons, the Suevi and the Visigoths. And today, 7 of those are represented by nations we're familiar with today. The Germans, the Swiss, the French, the Italians, English, Portuguese and Spanish. Isn't that interesting? How many toes do you have? 10. How many nations did Rome break into her toes? 10. It's uncanny, isn't it? And here they are on the map. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry